from Power FM. 5 songs in a row.
The gang came to give evidence at the public hearing, having been told they would face trial. At the heart of this inquiry is the allegations from the Lawrences and their lawyers that racism permeated the police investigation into Stephen's death and permeates the society in which it happened. Prince was brutally stabbed to death in a savage racial attack.
Since April 1993, when his son was murdered, Stephen's father Neville...
When the verdicts were announced, the entire family has come such a long way, and now it's fighting. Today's judgment left the Lawrence family and friends in tears as their desperate search for justice was shattered in a moment.
After his very special guest Clive Anderson, and they're followed at 7 by Pete Tong.
18-year-old Stephen Lawrence and his best friend Dwayne Brooks had spent their day at school. From there, they went into town to hang out, grab a bite to eat, and then over to Stephen's uncle's house to play some video games. Leaving around 10 to catch a bus. When realizing it was a longer route, they disembarked, hoping to catch another bus to get him home before curfew. By Brooks' own account, he left Lawrence standing at a bus stop and walked up the hill to see if he could see another bus coming. What happened next is supported by 3 other witnesses. 5 or 6 men, out of nowhere, ran up to Lawrence at the bus stop and started beating on him. In an attack that lasted no longer than 10 seconds, and then the group disappeared into the darkness. It was then that Brooks ran back to his friend, screaming that they needed to leave in case the men returned. They would then run 130 yards before Lawrence would collapse. He was dead before he hit the ground. Not realizing his friend was already dead, Brooks ran to call an ambulance, while a passing off-duty cop covered up the body with a blanket. The pathology report hadn't revealed anything that the witnesses hadn't already figured out. Young, healthy, probably had a good life ahead of him. Well, you know, if someone hadn't stuck a knife in him. Twice, and although witnesses say the attack only lasted about 10 seconds, they used their time well. Lacerations on his face, body covered with bruises, one knife wound downward into the neck, stopping in the shoulder, the other through the left arm, puncturing a lung. And it was that lung, along with blood loss from 4 major blood vessels, that sealed the deal. And the report concluded that even though the cops didn't administer first aid, it didn't matter, because even if Lawrence was sitting in a blood bank, he would have died anyways. But the cops didn't know that. Because when they lifted that blanket, they figured that Stephen Lawrence was just another gangbanger. Case closed. But after checking his background, they discovered that he was as clean as the sole on a cripple's boot. Friends and family told them that he didn't have an enemy in the world. But I'm guessing the cops figured because someone stuck a knife in his neck, it wasn't by mistake, and stuck it in twice, and he must have had at least one enemy. But what about the parents? Hard-working immigrants from Jamaica, father a handyman, mother works at a bank, younger brother and sister, good grades, good at sports, planning to be an architect. I guess at least on paper, Stephen Lawrence had a bright future ahead of him. But being suspicious as they are, the cops figured nobody knows nobody that well. And someone had to have a valid reason why they'd want to serve up a clean-cut 18-year-old kid on a crowded street on a Thursday night. But if the piggies were perplexed, they wouldn't be perplexed for long. Because it was only a day later that a good citizen came to their aid. You see, that's the thing about living in a city of scum. you'll always come across a rat or two. When cops had been called to a possible break-in at a pub, when they returned to their squad car, there was a note waiting for them on the windshield. And on that note was 4 names that someone figured were responsible for Lawrence's death. And it was then, in their infinite wisdom, instead of questioning anybody, they decided to lay low and maybe do some observational police work. And they put a tail on a local group of friends who had a reputation for having a hard-on against blacks. The bunch of friends, whose names were on the note, had a criminal record longer than a mongoloid's tongue. Drug charges, assault and battery, weapons, you know the score. And they probably don't give their seat up on a bus to a cripple either. What was more pertinent was that they all carried knives, and all of them had a hard-on for blacks. In fact, Gary Dobson had only cut one up a month earlier, and Neil Accord had got into a fight with a black classmate after school, and he spread his brains on the pavement like peanut butter on bread, using a hammerhead attached to a belt. And that list went on and on. And only 2 days after Lawrence's stabbing, the police had 26 tips, all pointing their filthy fingers in the friend's direction. Because in reality, the whole neighborhood was terrified of the teenage tearaways and couldn't wait for them to be put on ice.
On a beautiful... Did he say things like, I better wrap up, it's going to be a beautiful morning, but a little bit bright?
It had now been 2 weeks since the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and it seemed that everybody in town knew who killed him. Well, except for the police. And yeah, sure, the police had the gang under surveillance, but with Lawrence being the 4th death of a black kid in 2 years, and at least the black contingency believing that it were all racially motivated, so there were people who wanted answers. And yeah, sure, the community was a melting pot, but it was a melting pot full of spoiled meat with maggots coming out of it. But ask, and thou shalt receive. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, in a coordinated arrest, that the cops brought in Gary Dobson and his crew. And fish and chip eating cops had 48 hours to make a charge stick. And getting the charge to stick was riding on the best friend, who by his own admission had only seen the attack from a distance, and it was dark. In Brooks's statement, he'd said that the gang were yelling racial slurs as they set upon his friend. But there were 3 witnesses also standing at that bus stop, and they were closer than Brooks, and they disagreed. So as Brooks looked at police lineups, the cops moved in on the gang's homes. At Luke Knight's house, there was nothing. At David Norris's house, they found a hammerhead attached to a belt. At Dobson's, there was a very large kitchen knife in his bedroom. They would also later find a machete that he was keeping out of sight at his girlfriend's. And when they searched the Accord brothers' home, they found several knives and a large sword. While at the same time in the cop shop, they would tell him that they were a bunch of choir boys late for practice, and they'd never touched a weapon in their lives. But it was from the police lineups that Brooks was able to identify Neil Accord and Luke Knight, but unfortunately none of the others, so while Accord and Knight continued to plead their innocence, they were both charged with murder, while their amigos were cut loose. But the family's relief that their son's killers were now in custody would be short-lived. Because before the flowers on their son's grave would wither, prosecutors met up with investigators and came to the conclusion that there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. And Luke Knight and Jamie Accord, along with suspect Gary Dobson, were cut loose without charge. After that, the Lawrences attempted a private lawsuit, but that also fell flat.
If I wasn't angry, I probably would have fallen apart by now. It's the anger that's kept me going.
But it wasn't just the anger with the parents. It was now a collective anger in the whole country that was growing. There'd been newspaper reports of people walking right into the police station with evidence and being turned away. Proof that may help lead to a conviction. But police just didn't want to know about it, with rumors that someone was on the inside protecting the gang. And prosecutors' reason for dropping the case was simple. his best friend Brooks were all over the place like a retard on roller skates, falling flat on its face, changing each time he told it. But it was a year later, with mounting pressure from both the public and the press, including accusations of racism, that police opened a second investigation that included placing a surveillance camera in Gary Dobson's flat. What the surveillance footage reveals is a group of young men with a preoccupation with violence and knives that raised the question, if they hadn't killed Lawrence, then who were they gonna kill? With even a simple television commercial setting him off on a racist rant.
Bar drinking. The white fat bouncer out and look ugly cunt, nice looking black poster lady. Now the good looking black geezer in a club all having good times, fucking white geezer all boring.
Put some power and shame in it for.
And Luke Knight, smoking a joint, having a beer, watching a football match, gets triggered when the commentator says something positive about the team from Cameroon.
Contribution to the urban infringement that Jerry Francis.
Were they playing something fucking like Italy or something like a European fucking team?
Getting their first win.
It seemed that whatever the crew got up to, that knives and racial hatred was never far from the conversation. With Neil Accord showing his knife prowess on a chair. Then the conversation takes a more sinister tone.
Go right in. But if you want to cut something, you just put that bit on their face and go. That! I was wondering what you thought of that. And that! Absolutely.
In one segment, the group are seen getting ready to go out for the evening.
Come on, let's hit boxes. I'll get you down.
And Neil Accord is shown putting a large knife in his coat pocket before the group go out for the evening drinking.
If I knew I was going to go, if I was going to kill myself, you know what I'm saying? I'd go and kill every black, every pet, every cop, every nurse, if I know. I'm telling you. I'd go down and catch them, places like that, I'm telling you.
But it's interesting to note that with over 3 weeks of extensive surveillance footage in Dobson's flat, not once did anybody mention Stephen Lawrence. Yet prosecutors now felt that they had enough to take the case to trial, to prosecute Gary Dobson, Neil Accord, and Luke Knight for the murder of Stephen Lawrence. But that wasn't to be, because only 2 weeks into the court case, the judge ruled the surveillance footage taken in Dobson's apartment as inadmissible and dismissed it. And worse still, the prosecution's star witness, Lawrence's best friend Dwayne Brooks, was deemed unreliable and untrustworthy, and the case was dismissed. And because Dobson, Accord, and Knight had all pleaded not guilty, they couldn't be tried again because of double jeopardy laws in the UK. And they walked free. And even though all of England now knew who the killers were, the case was filed away and officially cold. But it was years later, when detectives were going through cold cases and matching them up against budgetary restraints, that Lawrence's case folder fell onto the desk of forensics. And they started going through the clothing that they had gathered from each of the suspects' homes. Even though they'd been warned by police that with the swiftness of the attack, the case was lacking in any forensic evidence. But the lead forensics officer felt that at some point there must have been contact, no matter how minimal it was, and set about exhaustively re-examining each of the items found. And then, with what many would have considered inexplicable odds, they found a microscopic speck of Lawrence's blood on one of the suspect's jacket and 2 of his hairs on another suspect's jeans, linking 2 of the gang to that bus stop.
The most far-reaching change to criminal law for nearly 800 years could soon be brought in. It's the scrapping of the double jeopardy rule that means a suspect can't be tried for the same crime twice.
Seized on the 7th of May 93 from your bedroom, some 2 weeks after his murder.
Floating down our halls.
Is there an innocent explanation for how this hair has appeared on those jeans?
That the bullets caused.
I'm asking you to account for the presence of fibres on your jacket. Again, exhibit action 5. These being identical to those in a red polo shirt worn by Stephen Lawrence at the time he was murdered. What is your explanation for those fibres being found?
Do we step into the light, let the sunlight burn us, peel off the skin that's kept the truth inside us, let the stones crush all the weary bones when the walls come down, let the tears pour out, wash away all
we pay tribute to Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence's courage and dignity. They have contributed to major changes within policing, the law, and indeed within society as a whole.
I'm so tired of lying about who we are. I don't know who we are.
We are very used to this type of thing where life is regarded as cheap in South Africa. But nevertheless, it's a sense of deep concern that it should happen in a country like Britain.
Where we gonna hide our broken hearts when the walls come down? When the walls come down, how can we keep hiding in the dark when the walls come down? When the walls come down, do we step into the light, let the sunlight burn us, peel off the skin that's kept the truth inside us, let the stones crush all our weary bones when the walls come down, let the tears pour out, wash away all the past, we can drown in the flood, let this breath be our last as the stones crush all we've ever known when the walls come down, 'cause we're the ones that built our cage. Let the walls come down. Do we step into the light, let the sunlight burn us, peel off the skin that's kept the truth inside us, let the stones crush all our weary bones when the walls come down, let the tears pour out, wash away all the past, we can drown in the flood, let this breath be our last as the stones crush all we've ever known when the walls come down.
We've never pretended to be angels. We've never pretended to be anyone else but ourselves.
So were you a group of little bastards on the estate?
Yeah, rascals, lovable rogues.
Legion forever!
The book says no more.